So, over the last 2 semesters, most of my lectures have focused on the experience of Native American loss of homeland and victimization by the US government. But this week, I'd like to balance it out by focusing a little bit on some of the less pleasant aspects of Native American heritage and a very controversial issue in reservation politics today. And that's the history of Native American involvement in slavery, not only of other Native American tribes, but of African Americans as well. Today we'll be watching a documentary on the Black Indians, which is an obscure but very important topic in Native American history. It's a source of ongoing controversy because recently the Cherokee and other slave-owning tribes of the past recently decided to strip black people of citizenship. That's the descendant of slaves of Cherokee Nation, Choctaw Nation, Seminole Nation. They no longer have citizenship. It's an important issue because critics accuse the Native Americans of racism. But for the Native Americans, it comes down to an issue of tribal sovereignty, the same thing they've been fighting for 200 plus years, is that we have an inalienable right to have our own policies on our own sovereign nations. But to start, I think it's important not to reduce slavery to stereotypes. We tend to, almost by default, think that slavery is a white institution of capturing black people. But in truth, history shows us that slavery is a basic economic system of every society in history, bar none. It's a basic way of organizing labor. And we have to consider that before Europeans, Arabs, blacks, and Turks had massive slave networks in Africa where they bought African people from African tribes. So, my point in saying so is simply acknowledging Native American participation in slavery doesn't isolate them as any guilty party. But still, we can't accept stereotypes. We can't accept the stereotype of Native Americans running around in loincloths and scalping people and taking slaves. But at the same time, we can't just accept the stereotype that Native Americans were docile and peaceful and one with nature and promoting human equality. In truth, Native Americans had the same economic needs as any other society. They had the same basic human functions of warfare. So they used the same institution of slavery in order to be competitive and dominant over other tribes. So I'd like to give you some examples of Native American involvement in slavery. First and foremost, most famous is the horseback tribes of the American Southwest, like the Shoshone, Apache, Comanche, and Navajo. They would constantly go out and raid villages and capture slaves after battles for the purpose of forced labor. On the other side of the continent in Canada, the Cree tribes, also in New York, that area of the Great Lakes, they would often raid villages for the sole purpose of capturing slaves that they would put on the slave market with Europeans. They bought guns from the French in exchange for fur, so they just made it more easy for the Cree to go into villages and capture slaves. In Oregon and Washington, among the Klamath Nation, it was a massively wealthy tribe that had a very staunch socioeconomic hierarchy, and you could even argue a caste system. Slavery was rampant. As many as a fourth of the population of the Klamath Nations consisted of slaves. It was such a common institution that it was considered basic family practice, that when two people got married, the families would sell slaves to each other as part of dowry. Among other tribes, like small bands in California, especially Northern California, some tribes even had hereditary slavery, where the son of a slave was born a slave. That was more strict than many parts of the United States. Lastly, among the Aztec, the Maya, the Pueblo, and even the mound-building tribes of Mississippi that we looked at last semester, they would often participate in capturing slaves for the purpose of sacrifice, human sacrifice, in order to appease their war gods to ensure a good harvest. Because again, war gods meaning they have to be dominant and competitive with other tribes. But the most famous Native American tribes involved in the slave trade in American history are the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Seminole, and the Muskogee Creek. Interestingly, these are the 5 tribes that George Washington considered the only tribes worthy of being called the 5 civilized tribes. Washington and the Founding Fathers admired these tribes as if they had the potential for civilization. They had the seeds of democratic governance, so they could eventually be paved towards citizenship. The U.S. government had the same attitude towards the Iroquois Confederacy. They had a very strong oral constitution that the Founding Fathers looked upon as like the genesis of American democracy, and they were inspired by. The Iroquois would constantly raid villages in the Great Lakes area for capturing slaves. But the fact that all these tribes participated in the slave trade didn't diminish their civilization or their humanity to the Founding Fathers. Instead, it was these tribes that the U.S. government gave special privileges as part of America's civilization policy. They would give them extra incentives and allow these tribes the quickest path towards American citizenship. In fact, it was the Cherokee, who were one of the most prominent slave-owning tribes, that were the first nation that got almost universal American citizenship. Most Native Americans had to wait until 1924 to get citizenship. Cherokee had it already by the time of the Trail of Tears, and they were forced out. But again, the Cherokee were one of the most rampant slave-owning populations on the continent. By the time of the Indian Removal Act in 1830, shortly before the Trail of Tears, there may have been as many as 5,000 slaves out of a total population of 15,000. By percentage, that's worse than white America, even in the Deep South. But still, to be fair, we have to understand that just like in white America, very few Cherokees actually owned slaves. Slaves were very expensive, very difficult to police them and feed them. So about 10% of the Cherokee population owned almost the entire slave population. Same was the case for white America. Even in the Deep South, very few people actually owned slaves. Excuse me. But on the other side, we have to be fair. There are many cases where African Americans would voluntarily flee onto Indian reservations for protection. Often Africans would feel that they would get better treatment if they went to Native American reservations because there's less hostility towards minorities. There's less racism, or so they hoped. Most famous case is a man named Billy Bowlegs III of the Seminole Nation. He was a black Indian who descended from the very famous chief Billy Bowlegs, who was a hero of the Seminole Nation who fought the U.S. government in 2 Seminole wars. They resisted valiantly, but eventually the entire Seminole population was forced all the way to Oklahoma, much like the other 5 civilized tribes after the Trail of Tears. But in truth, we have to imagine that this image of Seminole black fusion and multiculturalism is quite romanticized. Native Americans often celebrate this as a case that they were a tolerant society while America was still enslaving black people. It's not really the case. The main reason why blacks were so easily able to settle in Seminole country was because it was much more difficult for the Seminole to police their borders. It was often the case that these reservations had massive boundaries and very small populations. So it was much easier for black slaves to escape, settle onto the reservations, settle up country in the remote hills and woods, and it was less likely to become a case of public conflict as it would in white America or in urban society. So you do have cases of blacks intermingling and integrating into Seminole country and Native American societies, but in general, this proud image of multicultural fusion is very romanticized. It's also not so romantic for the Cherokee. After the Cherokee passed their own constitution as part of America's civilization and acculturation policy, in other words, the Cherokee wanted to create a constitution so that they could integrate into the United States. After they passed that constitution, the Cherokee were unique on the continent because no blacks of any kind could have any power to vote or have any political influence in the Cherokee Nation, at least officially. Not even mixed couples could vote or have any political office. This was not the case in the United States, where freed black people owned thousands of slaves in many cases. In Cherokee country, no blacks of any kind had any political influence, on paper at least. So eventually, by the time of the Civil War, the Cherokee, much like the other 4 civilized tribes, allied with the Confederacy against the Union. Why? Now we know that the Civil War was not really about a moral issue of defending slavery. It really came down to economics. The North was trying to basically dismantle the way of life of the Southern economy. Same was the case for the Native Americans and the 5 civilized tribes. They depended upon the institution of slavery for their economy to function. So of course, with the Confederacy, they were anxious to fight the United States, or the Union at least. But by the end of the Civil War, much like for the rest of the South, Abraham Lincoln banned slavery for the Native Americans as well. Even though the Cherokee were their own sovereign nation with their own policies, the U.S. government banned slavery on their reservations and freed their slaves for them. They also expected the Cherokee to give African Americans citizenship in their own sovereign nations. But while discrimination continued, can I hold questions for the end? No problem. While discrimination continued, this allowed some African Americans to integrate into Native American society because they were able to vote now, they were able to own businesses, so you did have some integration. So you do have segments of these 5 civilized tribes, the Seminole, the Cherokee, and the Creek, who are called freedmen. They're basically racially black, sometimes mixed, but in general they're racially, biologically black, but they adopt Native American culture and they consider themselves Cherokee or Seminole. But this is a very difficult issue for Native American society because constantly in Native American culture, they cast out their own members and even sometimes their own tribal elders as if they're fakes or whites. In many cases on reservations, you have the tribal elders or the chiefs are only a quarter Native American because of frequent mixing. So Native Americans are often casting out people that they don't really qualify. They're not one of us. It's even easier for blacks because they can say, you can't possibly be Native American, you're black. So it's creating a lot of hostility among these freedmen in these tribal reservations. So eventually, in the 1980s, the Cherokee decided that no blacks could have citizenship in the Cherokee Nation, now that they're their own sovereign territory. What happened was the Cherokee decided that in order to qualify for citizenship, you needed to prove Native American genetics according to the Dawes Roll of the 1880s. What happened was, around the 1880s, the reservations would work with the U.S. government in determining who had Native American ancestry. And that way, today, you can apply for citizenship if you can prove genetics based upon the Dawes Roll. But since the Cherokee decided that blacks did not qualify, since they did not have Native American genetics, 25,000 members of the Cherokee Nation lost their citizenship overnight. The same was the case for the Seminole. In 1990s, the black Seminoles, or the freedmen, sued the Seminole Nation for the tune of $46 million, asking for their citizenship back. The U.S. Supreme Court said, okay, but we need to hear the defense of the Seminole Nation. They're a sovereign territory. We need to hear their perspective in order for us to prosecute outside of our territorial jurisdiction. But since the Seminole did not accept blacks as citizens, they refused to come to the table, and therefore the Supreme Court struck it down because the sovereign perspective of this sovereign nation was not involved. So blacks still do not have citizenship in the Seminole Nation. Then things got really controversial in 2006 when the Cherokee were eventually pressured by the U.S. government, by interest groups, by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, to reinstate black citizenship in the name of human rights and civil rights. They argued that if Native Americans restrict their citizenship based upon race, that's the same thing as apartheid, basically, or the Nuremberg laws before Nazi Germany was totally established. The Cherokee eventually relented, and they decided to give black citizenship after 2006. But then again, things got more complicated, and in 2007, there was a special referendum where the Cherokee again decided to strip blacks of their citizenship. The Cherokee offered many excuses to justify their decision to strip blacks of citizenship. First one being, this is an intrusion by white society into our sovereign affairs. You can't import or export your value system onto these sovereign Native American nations. We don't have the same multicultural values that you do. We're our own sovereign culture. Second reason being, Cherokee often accuse blacks of trying to fake being Native American so that they could get welfare. Many Native American tribes do not have to work. They get welfare ad infinitum, unlike African Americans, for example. So they were accused of masquerading as Native Americans. And there's caricatures of stereotypically looking black people in headdresses. So basically, it's a fake. It's an attempt to get money out of the system. And eventually, 2011, the act that stripped blacks of citizenship was upheld in Cherokee Supreme Court. They're sovereign nations. They have their own sovereign policies, right? And then, in 2011, the U.S. government threatened to seize all welfare and all subsidy to the Cherokee Nation. Because again, this is against human rights. These are American fundamental principles that you have to uphold if we're going to give you all this subsidy. So, with the threat of bankruptcy, the Cherokee Nation held a special election for their current principal chief, and blacks were allowed to vote for this election. And they eventually ended up electing the current principal chief, Bill John Baker. Blacks could vote, but they weren't citizens. still do not have citizenship. But now, several congressmen, including in California, the ACLU, other civil rights groups, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs are even threatening to sever federal recognition of the Cherokee Nation as a whole. In other words, the Cherokee Nation would literally dissolve if this happens. But for the Cherokee, it's as always a very sensitive issue of tribal sovereignty. The Cherokee argue if the U.S. government terminates our reservation yet again, it would be no different than what Andrew Jackson did during the Trail of Tears. It's the U.S. government coming into our lands and doing whatever they please with us based upon their interests. It'd be no different than the termination policies of the 1950s when the reservations were terminated in the interest of Native Americans. Consider that the Cherokee Nation has been terminated multiple times. Shortly before the Indian Removal Act, the ancient homeland of the Cherokee Nation in Georgia was quite literally terminated. A new one was established in Oklahoma, to which they were forced marched during the Trail of Tears. That reservation, too, was terminated after the Dawes Act was imposed. It was terminated again when Oklahoma became a state, until it was eventually reestablished in its current form. So you can see the scars of 5 centuries of mistrust and broken treaties. They've made Native Americans of all colors paranoid over how they relate with the U.S. government. They're paranoid that the U.S. government always has some kind of surreptitious motive in mind whenever they relate to the Native American population, because that's been their experience for 500 years, or 300 years. So, while the Cherokee are not alone in combating these issues of racism, it's important to acknowledge the darker sides of Native American history, and we can't freely accept these stereotypes on either side. Native Americans were not brutal savages. They were also not peaceful individuals who loved equality of man. Every society has to compete over their own interests, and that's where we are today. So that's my lecture, and before we watch our documentary about how Native Americans fit into the broader slavery experience,